Hi everyone, this is Dr. Cairns, and this is a lecture on the integumentary system, more specifically the skin. So some reminders. The integumentary system, yes, it contains the skin, but it also includes your hair, your nails, your sweat glands, and your sebaceous or oil glands. But let's just talk about the skin. Two main layers or regions. The epidermis, which in this image is what is pulled up here. The epidermis, and that's epithelial tissue, which is avascular. And then underneath that, in the pink region of this image, is the dermis. And it's made up of connective tissues, so it will be very vascular. And you can see blood supply, you can see nerve endings, all kinds of stuff in that dermis. Let's talk about the epidermis. So it's mostly stratified squamous epithelium, and more specifically, keratinized stratified squamous epithelium. There are lots of cell types that you find in the epidermis. Most of the cells are keratinocytes. They are producing keratin, which is a protective protein. And it's there for waterproofing, for protection against friction. It's real tough. And so by the time the new cells, which are of the epidermis, which are going to form at the base of the epidermis, by the time those keratinocytes get pushed up to the very top layer, those cells are dead, and they're basically just keratin is all that's left. So when we say keratinized stratified squamous epithelium, that's what we're talking about. It's the keratinocytes that are the epithelial cells that you find here, and they're producing this keratin protein. There are different layers or strata of the epidermis. One of these is only in thick skin, and the images in the textbook don't show you what that looks like, but you can look elsewhere to find what that looks like. The very deepest layer down here at the base is called the stratum basale. It's the deepest layer, so it's going to be right above the underlying connective tissues of the dermis. Very actively dividing cells, so a single row of stem cells actively dividing, producing daughter cells constantly. We often call this layer the stratum germinativum. And so this is really the truly living portion of the epidermis. So as new cells divide, the older cells keep getting pushed up into these upper strata. So the strata above that is the stratum spinosum, or the prickly layer. And depending on the image or the model that you're using, you may or may not be able to distinguish among all of these different strata. So this is a good picture to use. Again, these cells are close enough to the underlying blood supply of the dermis that they're still living cells, but they're older than the ones from the stratum basale. They're getting pushed up toward the top. The next layer is the stratum granulosum, 5 to 6 layers thick. The cells are becoming more flattened. That layer is thin. This is the last living layer of cells. So they're still living, but they're not actively mitotic like they would be in the stratum basale. So then when we get above that, cells are dead. And so we have this last, oh, actually not last yet. There is this extra layer. You cannot see this layer in the image shown here, but it's the stratum lucidum. It does look clear. It's only found in thick skin. So thick skin is palms of your hands and soles of your feet. Dead keratinocytes. It'll be in between the stratum granulosum and the last layer, which is the stratum corneum. Stratum corneum, look at how thick it is compared to the other strata of the epidermis. So I would argue that the stratum corneum is really giving the entire epidermis its thickness, because there's a lot of cells here, 20 to 30 layers of cells. They are all dead, they're flattened, and they're basically just keratin. So it's the stratum corneum that's really serving as that protective mechanism of the skin. These cells are constantly sloughing off, but they will get constantly replaced because the stratum basale is undergoing mitosis all the time. All right, so that was the epidermis. The dermis, underneath that, underneath the epidermis, is the dermis. We're talking about connective tissue. So fibroblasts, macrophages, all kinds of other cells you're going to find in here. You're going to find an extracellular matrix. You're going to find nerves, blood vessels, lymphatic vessels, and all of the other structures associated with skin are found in the dermis. Your hair follicles, your oil glands, your sweat glands, all within the dermis. There's two layers of the dermis, papillary and reticular. The papillary layer, in this image, it's color-coded fairly nicely. It's this whitish layer when you can see these little blue nuclei in there. This is the papillary layer of the dermis. It is made of areolar connective tissue. And look at how it's shaped. It's almost like there are these little finger-like projections that are kind of projecting into the epidermis above. Those are called dermal papillae. And they're making those projections that are going to contribute to your fingerprints. Underneath that is the reticular layer. This looks like that marbled meat tissue I talked about in the connective tissue lecture. That's because the reticular part of the dermis is made up of dense irregular connective tissue. That's where you're going to see a lot of the blood supply, the hair follicles, and things like that. And I think that's where I want to end there with the skin. So we've got models in the lab and in practice anatomy lab of the skin that are going to show you the epidermis, the dermis, and all of the other components that I will talk about in a different lecture.